So we are here today with another exceptional guest. J. Adams Oakes is a writer, editor, and translator from Chicago. His first novel, Why I Fight, from Atheneum Books, Simon & Schuster, was a Junior Library Guild selection, an ALA Best Book for Young Adults, and won awards from the National Society of Arts and Letters, the Illinois Arts Council, and the Lincoln Award from the Illinois Teen Reader's Choice Master List. His short stories and essays appear in The Nervous Breakdown, River Oak Review, the Madison Review, Packingtown Review, Hypertext Magazine, and numerous anthologies, including Windy City Queer and The Way We Sleep. And we are very happy to have him on the show. Jeff, thank you for joining us here at the Tiffin Writing Workshop.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Good to be here.
I'm only slightly intimidated by your bio. It's really fun. Jeff and I went to school together. It isn't the policy of the show to only have people that Art knows, but we were very lucky to have access to such great writers, and they were gracious enough to come on. Yours is actually the second in our series. Dave Baker was on just a few weeks ago, so that was fun.
That's great.
Yeah. So anyway, Tim, how are you today, sir?
I'm doing okay. I'm very happy to have yet another guest and excited to get into the nitty gritty.
Yeah, that's always the goal, Jeff. We're really excited to know how in the world you pulled this off, right? Because this is sort of the before we get into it, though, if I could kind of share with folks Why I Fight, your novel. When was that published, by the way?
2009.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
So I've got the blurb from Why I Fight. One of the reasons that we kind of start off with the blurb is that we spent almost a whole episode talking about, why the blurb is so important and sort of how to write it. And I'm sure we're going to come back to that at some point in a future episode. But it's probably a good idea for folks who aren't familiar with the work to see what the book is about. So this is the blurb from Why I Fight by J. Adams Oakes. Wyatt Reeves takes the seat next to you, bloodied and soaking wet, and he is a big-fisted beast. Tell him to stretch out like an X across asphalt, and you've got a parking space. But Wyatt's been taking it lying down too long, and he is not happy. Since he turned 12 and a half, he's been living with his uncle, a traveling salesman of mysterious agenda and questionable intent. Soon, Uncle Spade sees the potential in Kiddo to earn cash, and that's enough to keep the boy around for nearly 6 years. But what life does Wyatt deserve? Alcohol? Drugs? Bare-fisted fights? Tattoos? No friends? No role models? Living in a car? If you're brave enough to stay and listen, you'll hear an astounding story. It's not a pretty road Wyatt has traveled. Growing up rarely is.
That's a hell of a blurb. That's a great blurb.
Thank you. I worked real hard on it.
Okay. Was it now? What was that like in getting the blurb done? Was it a back and forth between you and an editor or a publisher, or?
I was extremely lucky in my process. I had my book picked by Richard Jackson, who his first book was "Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret" by Judy Blume, and I was his last book before he retired. So we worked for over 3 years on edits for the book, and he did everything on pencil on hard copy, no computers.
Wow.
And so we literally mailed manuscripts back and forth. And one of the things that he did was have me start writing that from the beginning. I would send it to him along with the manuscript with its corrections, and then he would send it back with edit. It was an amazing process, and one I doubt happens anymore for people.
That's really amazing. Where do you know where he was living at the time when you what was the distance and how much time did it take to get a manuscript back and forth?
Yeah, he lived in DC, in Washington DC at the time, and I would say it took at least a couple weeks for sure. Yeah.
And how did you get used to that? Did you just fall into the routine of it, or was it always stressful to send him something, fearing the edits?
In the beginning, when he had first optioned the book, he flew to Chicago for a writers conference, and we met for lunch at the Intercontinental Hotel. And I remember he had a lobster sandwich for lunch, but other than that, I don't remember much of the meal. I was so starstruck by him. But one of the things that really stuck with me was he said, "I am not a writer. I'm an editor. I'm like the therapist to your book. And all I can tell you is what it's telling me it needs. And you're the writer who has to figure out how to do that." So very rarely up until the final draft did he ever change words in the manuscript. Most often it was questions in the margin and circles with a question mark and that kind of thing, so that I was doing all the work and they were all my words. Until
Wow.
the very end, when he went in and he said, "I don't think you've earned this word," or "I don't think this chapter can stay," that kind of thing.
That's sorry to railroad you, Art. I hope you don't mind my asking one more question,
No,
as
no,
I
go
find
for
this
it.
absolutely fascinating. Since you were working in this capacity where this, I mean, that's an amazing thought to be the therapist to your work.
Mm-hmm.
Because I mean, that would mean I'd need two therapists, one for me and one for the book.
Yep.
But what, not to throw anybody else that you've worked with under the bus, obviously, or anything like
Mm-hmm.
that, but do you find, was that your only occurrence of having an editor that had done that? Or has it helped you look at your own work? You know what? I'm so amazed by this story. I'm asking 5 questions of you at once. First one, I'm so sorry. The first one then is, with this style, with the him asking you questions in the margins, do you take to that better than someone that comes in and sort of like strikes out lines? And have you experienced the other type of editing that we're more sort of familiar with in a sort of stereotypical editor sense?
Yeah. He was the first major editor I'd worked with after grad school. This book was my thesis for Columbia College. The first draft of it, I did 4 major rewrites on it, all with Richard Jackson. And so that was my first, other than a few short stories here and there, it was my first major work with an editor of his caliber, and I was spoiled by it. Absolutely. I recognize now how lucky I was to have gone through it. I told people it felt like I got another master's degree with the work that we did. I feel like now I understand how the rest of the world works, using, shared Google documents and that kind of thing, or tracking our edits in an app is so different than having the weight of the manuscript. I kept each draft next to my desk, and they stacked up to the height of my chair where I sat, and to literally get to feel the impact of how many pages had been rewritten again and again. I get it now. I'm okay working with other editors. I get how it has to happen, but it was pretty luxurious working with Richard on the different drafts each time, and the things he went after with me on them. Oftentimes in the beginning, often it was us just discussing it and him asking me a question and then saying, "Okay, go write that. That's not in this book." The first one he said to me is, the book takes place while Wyatt, the main character, is on a bus trip leaving his family behind. And he said the longest a bus ride you could have from the far northern part of the East Coast all the way to Southern California can only last so many hours. Do you really want to listen to someone talking that whole time? So I had to justify the length of the book according to how much Wyatt could tell and keep the listener listening. And that is not what I had written to start out with at all.
Yeah, because for those who haven't read it, it is a first-person narrative from the point of view of Wyatt, if I remember that correctly. And I
Yes.
remember that he also has a very particular way of speaking, really
Yeah.
bordering on dialect. Tell us a little bit about how it was to write an entire novel with that sensibility.
It's funny. I just had someone read the book recently for the first time who was Black, and they asked me about the vernacular because he said it sounds familiar to me, but it's not completely familiar, and was asking about it. And the closest I can approximate is the accent I heard in Iowa when I was in elementary school. The rural kids, the farm kids, had grammar that was unique to them, and I feel like they had words that I hadn't learned yet that they used in different ways. And as I started to create Wyatt during grad school, it's the only time it's ever happened to me, but I started to hear Wyatt's voice and felt like I was channeling him as I got settled into it, that I could hear him talking, or had to hear him talking, because otherwise it became my voice. And before that, I'd written mostly third person, so it was hard not to to put the sort of third person narrator in to give him fancy words. And I really love a good fancy sentence, and Wyatt would never say them, so I had to cut a lot of darlings out there.
Yeah, only if you were repeating something he heard from somebody else, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. Like one of the things that I found fascinating, the right before it was printed, Simon and Schuster sent me. They have a department that reads a book for consistency, and they write a dictionary of your own book for you and show you where you're wrong. So this book was heavy with that, which is they would say Wyatt said ain't this many times. He said isn't here, here, and here. Therefore, these are ain'ts. And there were words like he doesn't say National Geographic in the book. He thinks it's giraffic, like a giraffe. And so they went through and said, you used it here. It has to be here and here as well. And I'd never seen someone take such go at such detail into the book and to prove me wrong in my own work, to make it consistent.
That's wild.
Wow, that is just the person that comes up behind you and says, "I think you're supposed to be using a half teaspoon of salt in this recipe, correct?"
Exactly. Yeah.
That editor's title is the actually editor. So actually, you didn't mean that.
You said that, Art, and all I saw was someone pushing their glasses up the bridge of their nose. As three people, I think, who wear glasses in this conversation, I was just like, yes.
Yeah, exactly. So tell us about how the idea originated, and also if you can lead into sort of how you got picked up by such a legendary editor who spoiled you with luxuriousness.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if I'd written it when we were in grad school together, Art, but I started with a short story of a child sitting in a living room that was cluttered and unkept, and the child not knowing when their parents would come back, and it had been days since they'd been neglected. And I'm always curious about childhood suffering in a very private way. We all suffer in one form or another, and that experience is our own. You can grow up with siblings and have totally different childhoods, even though you were around each other. And the boy he opens a Sterno can and starts to burn Sunday comic strips in it. And eventually the little pieces get on the curtains and start it on fire. And he burns down the house and is pretty happy about it because his parents give him attention. That was the end of the piece that I turned in class. And it got really great responses, which always helps. But I kept thinking about that kid. I wanted to know more. It was the first time I wanted a character to continue past the short story, and started to write more about him until one of my friends said, "You know what those are called, right? Those aren't stories, they're called chapters." So I hadn't really planned on writing a novel about Wyatt. I just dumbly stumbled into it. And because it's a road trip story, it can be in segments that happen and skip time from moment to moment, and is on the whole is chronological as he's telling it. But I had to finish it for thesis in order to graduate. And right out of grad school, I got a corporate job, and I worked for a year and never touched the book. And I panicked that I was going to be that person who said that they were still working on thesis for their master's degree when they were, 80 years old. And so I quit the job. I shaved my head, got a U-Haul, and moved in with one of my high school friends and her husband in Arvada, Colorado. Lived with them for a year.
And this is the subject of the piece, Sit, correct?
Yeah. Oh yeah, you read that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a great piece. Yeah, it's really nice. Yeah.
Thank you. I think it's that thing of, as a starting writer, it's hard to just sit in that chair. And what my friend Claire and her husband gave me was the ability to just sit with this book, to produce the majority of it in their home, and to not worry about anything else, which is a huge gift for a writer. I mean, I didn't realize at the time what that really meant. But yeah, was very lucky to, Claire said to me, as long as you write for 4 hours a day, you can live with us for free. And so every day they come in and say, did you write? And I have to say, yep, I got it done, no matter what.
And then they would unlock the door and give you a plate of food under the table. Are these friends of yours? Are they still looking for someone to live with them for 4 hours or 5 hours a day?
Seriously.
Just kind of want to mention that it's a really wonderful piece on writing, and that's in Hypertext Magazine. So I think a quick Google search should bring folks to that piece.
Yeah, after that, after I graduated with the piece, I decided to move back. The novel finished, and graduated from school. I moved back from Colorado to Chicago. I missed it so much. All I did was talk about Chicago to everybody in Denver. And they were like, you should move back there. You were happier there. And I was like, oh, you can never go home. And they're like, in this case, we think you can. And so I moved back and I started working as a bartender at a restaurant. And I just told everybody I knew that I had written a book. Anybody asked about what I do, I didn't talk about anything else. I just tried to network the hell out of the thing. And I think it was 2 or 3 years after that I had a regular at my bar who said, my sister and I went to high school with a woman who I think is an agent, a literary agent. She lives in Hollywood. I might be able to try and reach out to her. And I was grateful for that, because most of the agents I had tried to find would sort of pitch my book back to me and then never get back to me. There was a lot of unreturned calls and disappointment. So I eventually got Barbara Markowitz to accept me into her roster. And she is an interesting woman. She started a bookstore here in Chicago called Barbara's Bookstore in the 60s, when Hugh Hefner had started Playboy in Chicago. And Hefner had a big row with our mayor at the time and said, I'm taking Playboy out of Chicago and moving it to Hollywood, and you'll lose all this money. And Barbara's husband was one of his many lawyers. And so they had to move. She sold her bookstore and had to move to LA in order to follow Hefner out there.
Now, just a side note, do you know if Hugh Hefner needs anyone to write for 4 hours in his house, or?
I would hope so. There've got to be people who need us around to write in their houses.
They're moving to Chat GPT now. I mean, it's staggering as I listen to your sort of origin story as the writer superhero that you are, that you've had so much interaction with greatness, that you've been like in the right place at the right time. And look, not to say you haven't hustled. You wrote the book. You wrote it 5 times, right? Because you wrote it once and then you had to revise it 4 times. So you have put in the sweat equity. But it's amazing how many fantastic people have kind of come into your life to support you and help you and get you where you were. That's probably because you're awesome. But also, like, is that the way it has to? Is this the recipe? Well, you just have to know a lot of really cool people who will help you along.
I've never heard the literary journey repeat itself. I think everybody's journey seems to be totally unique. But I do think that there's a commonality, which is one of the hardest things for us solitary writers to do is to network. And that we don't want to leave our desk once we've practiced being at it forever and sitting in that damn chair. Then it's hard to drag ourselves out to the readings and meet new people and talk about your work. And I think it's getting harder and harder to even find the right people to talk to, because there aren't as many events after COVID. The readings that are happening in Chicago before COVID were easily 20 events in the month, and now there's maybe 5 or 6 readings going on. But those are the ways that I'd start to meet people, and they would suggest to talk to somebody. At least in Chicago, it's not as competitive as in New York or LA. I think we all sort of try to network and say, oh, you know who you need to meet is this person, and let me take you to talk to them. But I do think that you have to talk yourself up. You have to have the elevator speech ready. you have to believe in yourself enough to talk about it, even online as you're reaching out to agents and sending the letters. It's a lot of lack of response from people, and you just got to stick with it.
Yeah, as far as like the self-promotion piece, I think you had mentioned earlier in the interview that you wrote the book blurb very, very early in the process.
Yeah.
So did you have a complete draft before you wrote it?
I did. I had the rough draft that Richard Jackson accepted, and he asked me to write that blurb early on. In fact, he gave me the measurements for the inside cover and said, your words have to fit in these inches. It wasn't even numbers of words. It was the space in which I could squeeze it. So I created a document with really narrow margins and just would type into it. It's the same way I came about the title for the book. It was originally called Shreds. And Richard said to me, Wyatt is telling a story first person. Do you think that's the name he would give to his own life? And don't you think he has the right to name his own life? And I was a little indignant at that because of my amazing title, I thought. And so I said, I don't know. I can think about that. And I would send him one or two, and he would send them back crossed out in the next envelope, along with edits on the blurb. And finally, I think probably drunk one night, I wrote like 20 titles for the book that Wyatt would name it. And in amongst them was Why I Fight. And he simply circled that and sent it back to me in an envelope.
That is, you were just talking about the various different ways that the writer's journey happens and how we find our success. And I think the worst one is when you find that brilliant piece that makes everything fit into place when you're either drunk or stoned or angry at an ex or something. Yep. You're like, I don't want to repeat that.
Uh-huh. I think it's the distraction from it. Sometimes there's a not staring directly into the manuscript.
Yeah.
I find that that's hard to explain to people, the allowing things to stew, allowing the words just to settle and sit and move away from it, because oftentimes by not paying attention, that's still brewing in my brain, and so stuff will pop up. And I maybe that's a version of being high or drunk, distracted. You're distracted from it all.
Yeah, we've talked about this a lot. Art and I have talked about some of our best ideas coming when we're just walking the dog and away from the chair, or just doing the dishes or something.
Right. Absolutely. And I think it can be a mistake to push too hard, put too much pressure on the words, that oftentimes you can ruin a good sentence by over editing it or overthinking it. And I think it all needs a little breathing space for sure. And maybe that's what you were asking about the manuscript mailing it back and forth. I do think that did force me, in the time that Dick had the manuscript, it gave me that forced breathing space. I couldn't work on it till I got his responses.
Oh, what a wonderful way to have something of an excuse to not have to fret about it or to let your mind wander.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that.
And when it arrives in the mail, I imagine that thock, when you drop the manuscript, is the starter pistol, and you're like, oh my God, I got to get this back to him as soon as I can. Did you feel that as well?
Oh yeah. Well, and reading his comments was like Christmas Day. To have someone pay attention to your work in that detail, and to be so smart about it, was just a treat. We don't get that very often in what we do. And I've realized that criticism, good or bad, from people about the work and process is a gift, because most of us in our writing lives don't have time to attend to others, especially as you get older. There's just no room for that. So I really appreciate when that comes around. And what he did was the genius level. So I felt like there were only maybe 3 or 4 things that I fought him on and had to win him over. One of which was that in the book, all of the arguments are in all caps. And I had always appreciated that from Herbert Selby's Last Exit to Brooklyn. There's a whole chapter of people yelling out the window at each other and couples arguing in an apartment building. And in my family, we didn't argue like that. We didn't raise our voices, much less yell. And Dick said that I needed to take the all caps away. It was distracting. And so instead I went to my bookshelf and I pulled examples of how it works and Xeroxed them and sent him copies of famous novels and stories that used all caps for yelling. I said in Wyatt's family, they yell.
May I ask a quick question just about that?
Yeah.
How did you learn to push back? How did you learn to sort of, and not push back in a sort of negative sense, like you're going to have a fight over it, but, working with someone who has such a history that you look up to, that you feel lucky that you were working with, was the, that sort of thick skin of receiving criticism. I'm sure we all have to learn very early as writers, but how did you, for me, I would, get something like that and say, oh, absolutely, I will do whatever you tell me. How did you come about that? Was it easy for you, or did you have to kind of struggle with yourself to do it?
I think there's a growth, there's a shift as a young writer starts to gain experience. It's hard to let down your guard enough to let the criticism in and not feel like it's about you personally, that it is critique or insult, versus we're trying to create art here and I have help to do. I have someone to discuss that with. So I found it more to be a discussion of what was going on. And I had to learn that discussions include disagreeing, and it doesn't do me any good to push back on something out of my own ego, but rather to look at what it did for the book itself. In fact, there's one chapter in the book that I just loved, and it was about Wyatt making a new friend, and they go on an adventure together. And it's so rare that he's around other children in the book. He's almost always with adults, that he learns how to be a kid with Clark. And Richard said, I think we need to take the chapter out. And I was like, no, it shows such an important part of Wyatt, and it is such a delicate moment. And I went and I argued for it, and he said, but what does it do to move the story forward? And it did nothing. And I just couldn't prove that it did that. And so it had to come out. That was like taking a lot of teeth, not just one, killing a pile of babies.
Did you try photocopying other books to say, no, I have to, just like you did with the all caps? Like, wait, hold on a second. Hold on. Let's look at this film. Look at these.
He was right. If I could have even rewritten it to do something to move it forward or figured that out, then I would have. Just because it was there didn't mean it should be there. And It's hard to see. As writers, we're so subjective, and it's so close to us and dear to our hearts if we're doing it right, that, boy, having to take something like that away and admit to it is really tough. In fact, I changed the names and submitted it and got it published somewhere else.
See, that's great. Yeah, Art and I have talked about before. I'm a huge U2 fan, and I know other bands do this, but sometimes they mix and match pieces of songs from other, from disparate songs to put them together into something that becomes a big hit. But then that stuff they cut out just becomes a different song. So I'm glad that must have felt great that you were able to kind of make that into something else.
Yeah. I'm always shocked, like in the movies where someone's typing away on a typewriter and they go, oh no. And they tear that paper out and scrunch it up and throw it in the garbage can that's overflowing. I save everything because maybe I'm hoarding a little bit, but all those words, especially now in my computer, if I remember that I wrote something on that theme before, I can search the word and find that manuscript or that sentence that was unused and repurpose it. And I think that sometimes you're writing stuff that just isn't in the right place or at the right time, or I don't know why I'm writing it. So it needs to be set aside I have stories I've been writing, I'm still working on from grad school that I go back to and say, but I don't understand what's the point here, but I'm not going to get rid of it. So it's like in the movies where they get mad and then they sweep everything off the table to show how mad they are. I'm like, why did you just break all your things? You know,
You could catalog those. You could search those in 10 years. What are you doing?
Hey, depression hits us each differently, okay? Sometimes a good table sweep is what you need to do.
I'll tell you what, my depression hit when I went back and read. We talked about this a while back. I found, all this wonderful stuff that I had done, and I went back and kind of started reading it and was crestfallen at how bad it was. Because I really thought I was further along back then than I was. And it was the quality of the language was good, but like there was nothing behind it. There was just like there was nothing there. And I'm like, damn, I have to start over. So this whole process of doing the show and reconnecting with Tim, reconnecting with people, thinking critically about the work has been transformative. That leads into my next question, which was, you said earlier that you felt like you got a second master's degree by working with Richard. Tell us a little bit about some of the things that you thought you knew coming out of graduate school that maybe morphed or changed in the process of writing this book.
Well, I do think that one of probably the biggest gifts he gave me was being able to step back and see the whole manuscript. In grad school, the instructors that I had didn't really talk about the bulk of the material. Many of them hadn't written a whole novel and couldn't talk about it. And some of them that had, it didn't mean they understood it. And I think because Dick Jackson was an editor for so many decades, he was constantly looking at the over arc of every story. And so what he would show me is that everything's connected and how to be aware of that, to see what each piece did to move the story forward. And I mean, certainly with that being my first novel, I just wrote, like I said, a bunch of short stories and stuck them together, put the title as a chapter number instead. But I had no clue what truly looking at a manuscript in its entirety. I couldn't even do it, or I couldn't even fathom what that looked like when I first started before he taught me.
One of the things that we're looking at doing, Tim and I are on the cusp of starting our own novels, and having these author interviews with successful novelists like yourself gives us an opportunity to ask the kind of questions that might set us up for success as we do it. One of them is the process of outlining. And I understand that everybody's process is a little different. So that's one of the reasons we're excited to kind of ask a lot of different people, how'd you do it? I've heard these terms, plotter and pantser. I'm curious, did you do an outline for your book? If you did, when did you do that? What'd that look like? Just tell us about that.
I didn't with Why I Fight. I spent time literally with the printed manuscript as Richard wanted to work with it, and laid it out on the floor physically and had the chapters in a row, and then I would move them and see what they did. I didn't know. I didn't even, there was no discussion of outline for me. I suppose maybe I started to think of it that way on the other end, which is looking at the chapter list and realizing that some things could shift. But I certainly did it with this second novel that I'm just finishing, because I was like, I'm not going to ever do it without an outline again, because it constantly was shifting. I mean, it's a huge part of probably why we went through as many drafts as we did, was because I would try rearranging all of Why I Fight and then putting it back the way I had it, or seeing how cutting the chapter, what it was going to do when you butt two moments up against each other, what that looks like to turn the page from the end of one chapter and open up to the next is incredible, to start to see the accumulation as you go.
Yeah, I mean, that's interacting with the physical product as you're drafting it. That's got to be surreal.
I mean, maybe it's generational too, but I really like sometimes just printing even a few pages out, having it in my hand. Anything to break up my rituals a little bit, reading it out loud to myself, just to hear it, to see why it's bumpy or whatever. Like there are those kind of physical things that come off the computer for a bit. Journaling, I'll handwrite stuff and then type it in so that there's a second edit. Yeah, but the outline for the second book was just crucial because is much more massive. This book is 170 pages, and that's what the max that he could accept. I had to cut it down from 300 to 170 pages for Simon & Schuster to fit into their young adult section.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about the whole young adult. Did you write it as a young adult novel, or was that a marketing decision that happened after the draft was done?
Yeah, admittedly, I was a little snotty about that because back then, I just heard when they said young adult, I just heard kids books. I hadn't realized how much young adult had changed since I was reading, the Hardy Boys or whatever. And I feel like I had to go and educate myself about what young adult was and what it could be, because obviously it's come into this like golden age where everybody's writing a young adult novel now. And at the time, I just wrote a novel. I was like, I'm just writing classic literature here. I just want to be, up there with Steinbeck and everybody else. And
Sure.
Instead, I was being told that I was going to be put in the kiddie section. And that took me down a couple pegs. Realizing what it was actually a gift to be given that, because it focused who my audience was. And then Dick and I could talk about the audience and how it would receive certain themes and certain parts of Wyatt's life, and that you're writing for someone. The character is a young adult, and and most of the readers are young adults. How will they understand certain things? And it changes the way you write. I was very snotty in the beginning because I told him, well, Wyatt is telling this story to a stranger on the bus and not to young adults. And that's when he told me that that's not the book I'd written. But I mean, I thought I'd get it off my back about it. And instead he came back with, okay, well, I'll respect that decision, but then here are the following things we need to do to change it. So it defeated the purpose. Instead, I think it taught me how to really find audience, to listen for what the audience is, and take some time to think about that. Who do I want reading my book? That kind of thing. And it's a marketing thing too, Art. I think what you said, the other side of it is the company, if they're going to buy the book, they need to know how they're marketing it. So they want to put you in a little box somewhere, for sure.
One of my favorite stories is I got to interview the lead singer of my favorite band, Living Colour, and it was 15th anniversary release of their album Vivid. And the sticker on the front of the album said the pioneering album from the originators of rap rock. And as anyone who knows Living Colour will tell you, they didn't rap at all. And the lead singer, when I asked him about this in an interview, he said they just need something to sell it with, man. They just need some little slogan that they can sell it to the masses with. So did you feel, was that part of, I mean, Art's very, very good at writing and being very technical, and he's just the smart guy of the bunch. I'm the one that sort of sits in the corner for 5 hours fretting that no one likes me. So how do you deal with that mentally? You've talked about how it took you down a couple pegs. Was it something that you had to kind of struggle with, or was it sort of like, was that the aha moment that made you move forward with this sort of new audience in thinking about it marketing wise?
It took me a little while to accept that. I think it took me going into that section in the bookstore and the library and really looking at what was out there and realizing that there are some really great stories being told and respecting the audience of young adults, and that they want good story too. But the term young adult was shifting even as I was writing, because now they talk about new adult, which is slightly older people, and they're breaking it down into all these subcategories. And it's so they can have a new way of getting someone's attention. There always has to be the new thing. So though I don't think, I certainly didn't plan for any of that before I had the book accepted. It is part of the grudging work that the writers have to do. I mean, it's like doing readings. It's the irony of us spending so much time alone, and then the only way you really get out there is to then have to stand in front of a crowd and read your stuff.
Yeah, like
That
what's
was
that all about?
horrifying for me.
It's terrible.
I told an actor friend of mine I was going to hire him to be me at my readings. And they could just do all the work for me so I could stay at my desk.
That's brilliant. Let's do
That's
that.
I like that idea. That's really great. I mean, that's a whole mythology. That's fantastic.
I will tell you, when Dick retired, he assigned me to a new editor at Simon & Schuster for my next book. And then about 6 or 8 months into that, they did a mass layoff of like 50% of their editors, and then doubled the work for all the other people. And I never heard from my new editor. And so I met with someone from another publishing company. I flew out to New York to meet with him, and he was like, I loved Why I Fight. I really want to, figure out what your next book is about and talk to you. And he literally, the thing that he led with was, we need to be able to sell it to our marketing team. So what's our pitch going to be? And I was like, well, you're going to put the pitch before the book. I don't know what the story's about until the book's done. and it was sort of, it was such a shock to hear them really forced to be part of the machine that, you have to give in to some of that stuff in order to get it out there. I will say too, I made a specific choice when I was younger that I wanted an agent, and I wanted my book to go into a big house because I wanted as many people to read it as possible. I could have gone the other route of not getting an agent and going to the small publishers who can love on a book but have no marketing budget at all. So that was a clear choice on my part.
And yeah, at that point, it feels like we have to make a decision. Are we going to create an art object that few people will appreciate, but might be really good? Or are we going to create a product for people to consume that we're going to try to make as good as it can be? And I don't struggle with that at all. I'm clearly on the art object side. I like who cares who buys it, but like for me, it's really just about, hey, can I actually do this work? I would like to find out if I can do this well, and if I can do it well, and nobody buys it. All right, that's fine. But like I want to be able to do it well.
I think that's a huge thing for writers to do, to take the time and say, why am I writing? Who am I writing for? What do I want to get out of this? Because you'll disappoint yourself if you're not aware of what that is. And there are so many different reasons to be writing. You can write a manuscript and toss it in a drawer and leave it there, or you can try and do something with it. But you can waste a lot of time going the wrong direction too.
Yeah.
I've talked to a lot of young writers about that. The fact of deciding what you want your work, how you want it to exist in the world,
Yeah. Do you instruct? I think I saw that you do mentoring or coaching.
Yeah, I over the years I've taught a few fiction classes. I taught at Columbia College. I taught a young adult class for a little while. My problem is that teaching is hard to do and keep the writing going. That I feel as to be a good teacher, you need to commit fully to your students, and that means you don't have much time for yourself. So I found I bartended for 20 years, and that was what allowed me to write in the morning and go to work at 3 or 4 in the afternoon and being happy that I had created art ahead of time. The classes were a lot of fun, and I think it's really interesting to be around eager, creative souls and watch them try and figure it out, encouraging them and stuff. But it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work to do those. And I work at a high school right now, and I started a writing club with some of the kids. I started with 3 kids in it, and now we have 12, as opposed to most of the other clubs that have dozens and dozens. But I it's fun to just get that excitement going,
Yeah.
See the sparkle in their eyes still.
So Jeff, we talked a lot about your first novel. You mentioned earlier that you were working on your second. Tell us what's going on with you right now. What are you working on now?
Yeah, I've spent most of COVID really just trying to get my short fiction out there. I never thought I was going to write a novel. I always thought I just would write the short stuff. And it was piling up. So I felt like I was more in control of that. And the book that I've been working on is now, it's like almost 10 years I've been working on it, but it takes place in Spain. And it's a story about an American kid who screws up in the States and flees life, going to Spain thinking that he'll be able to be a different person and change life and figure it out in somewhere that he has no connection to and no understanding. It's completely out of his depth. But when I started writing the book years ago, I started writing about Spain, and I would tell people, "Oh, I'm writing a book about Spain." People immediately say, "Oh, Hemingway." And they don't know what else to say, especially non-writers. That's just their only connection, It's like, and I thought, oh God, I need to reread Hemingway so that I'm not reproducing any of his work like I could, but even thematically to be aware of it again. And then I started rereading a bunch of. I thought this was a young adult book too, and I'm not sure if it is. I keep wavering. But I started rereading all the classics we read in high school. And one of them that struck me was rereading Grapes of Wrath, where the chapters in between the main story are basically little history lessons or socioeconomic lessons about the Dust Bowl and what happened. And as I researched that structure, I was fascinated by the intercalary chapters, what they did, how it worked. And so my book now is fashioned in the same way, where there's the main character moving forward, bumbling through Spain, and then an intercalary chapter that talks about the culture of Spain and what's going on around him, what he missed, what he can't see, what he can't understand because of the language he's missing, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, those were almost like prose poems. I think you and I chatted about this recently, Jeff.
Yeah.
The turtle, crossing the road.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's so great because it's like
Exactly.
this little metaphor that informs the main narrative, but it stands alone, and it gives you a breather from that main narrative, because the main narrative is a slog, just like going,
Yes.
we're going to California, and like, okay, and I actually appreciate those in between chapters a lot more because they're more poetic and.
Yeah.
So it's good. So, well, I'm glad that you're adopting that. That's a very cool stylistic choice.
It has been, as a short story writer, it's been really fun to be able to write these concise pieces about things that I've wanted to write that don't necessarily move the story forward, but add to the surroundings and that kind of thing. So I'm excited for others to read it soon.
Are you working with an editor on that right now, or are you still drafting that on your own?
No, I'm working on my own because the editor from Simon & Schuster, I was never reassigned to anyone, and I was sort of scared that they might be going under because they had gotten rid of so many editors. And then when I met with that other editor at HarperCollins, I need to rethink this whole thing. I don't know if that's the direction I wanted to go, setting up a marketing plan, and that's all that it is. But again, that was from me being spoiled by Richard Jackson's way of editing with me. So my agent has retired as well. She was 85. So I have to look for a new agent and a new editor. Back to the drawing board.
So you're literally moving from one era of publishing into a new era of publishing. Like,
yeah.
You better get that Instagram page up and running.
You're not kidding. Get my socials.
Welcome to the Oaks TikTok.
I'll do some little dances and then talk about my book.
Well, I think we're missing an obvious. It's Oak Talk. Come on now.
Oh,
we got to do that.
Good.
Strong advice on writing. There you go. It's happening. That's right. Grow your writing career. There it is. Come on, this thing write itself, man. Jeff, is there any advice that you would leave as we kind of wrap up our episode today? And thank you so much for coming on and sharing these great stories with us. I feel smarter, and that's always the goal. But as far as like some parting wisdom for maybe emerging or established writers out there who are looking to do this work and kind of look to you as an example, what would you tell them to do?
Yeah. Well, it's my pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me. It's been great talking. I think, One of the most important things is to be kind to yourself as the writing is happening, because it is such an uncertain thing, and the journey is always in doubt. And so rarely do you have those moments of, I mean, the people that have succeeded talk about getting an agent, getting an editor, but all the work and insecurity behind that is something that is really hard to face. And it's you have to be kind to yourself and just chug along. It's like applying for a job. You just send out those applications and can't worry about it, because they're out of your control after that. The best thing to do is just keep moving forward.
Or to just find someone who lets you stay at their house for 4 hours a day. So do you have a couch I could stay on?
You're welcome anytime.
So the worst part about that is that you'd be like, oh yes, then I have this for you. Oh, great. And I still wouldn't write anything. That's like, what have you been doing?
Dude, but when your housing is threatened, right? Like, you can stay here as long as you write. I wonder, that didn't sour the writing experience for you at all, did it? Where you're like, oh my God, I have to do this or else I'm going to get kicked out.
There was a lot of guilt on my own end of, like, when I would watch Jerry Springer instead of writing, and then they'd get home and I'd be like, well, a little.
I did a lot of research today. A lot of research.
I wrote about 100 words, but they're all Jerry with an exclamation point. Jerry. I'm not really sure where the inspiration hit.